Although Irene Ryan was widely recognized as Granny from the Beverly Hillbillies, she had a stunning secret. The actor who played her son-in-law was just 5 years her senior. They claimed she looked too young for the part, so she lied when she was 60 years old to obtain it. She squandered her $500,000 salary on a dilapidated apartment. She passed away entirely alone, having never had children of her own. Forgotten is the woman who brought laughter to millions of people's lives. You will be deeply saddened by what happened to her house following her death. In El Paso, Texas, on October 17, 1902, Irene Ryan's birth name was Jessie Irene Noble. At Fort Bliss, her father James Noble was a sergeant with low rank. All the way from Ireland, Katie McSherry, her mother, had hoped for a better life. Their resources were limited. Irene was born into a modest home, not a hospital, close to downtown El Paso. The Mexican Revolution began in 1910, and at the time, Fort Bliss was expanding rapidly due to this. Tensions were high due to the presence of almost 6,000 soldiers stationed there in 1915. The early world of Irene included that wartime strain. As the border war escalated and her father's salary was low, the family struggled to make ends meet. Not all meals were guaranteed. We were now in the midst of the Mexican Revolution's anarchy. El Paso had evolved into more than just a town. Now it was teeming with rebels, refugees, and peril. There was a near violence. Charities provided food for those like the Noble Blitz. Despite her tender years, Irene experienced intense hunger. She couldn't shake it. It sparked a desire in her to seek more meaning in life. It pushed her to fight even when she was a tiny girl. There was no guarantee of safety. The stores were frequently deserted, and the prices were exorbitant. Superimposed on it, vigilante organizations emerged. It was not a safe period. Her family had to squeeze into small quarters and share everything. Irene became a strong and perceptive person as a result of her relentless fight for survival. Essentially, she was an only child during her formative years. In 1885, she welcomed her lone sibling, Anna. She became 17 years older as a result. Anna had departed before Irene could utter a word. As a result, Irene led the life of an only child, constantly in the company of grown-ups. She overheard adults discussing the war, financial woes, and the army on a daily basis. She figured out how to amuse herself. She mastered the art of attentive listening. Despite her youth, she grew smart, self-reliant, and mature. While she was alone as a child, she learned to pay close attention, which served her well when she had to do challenging roles and stand on stage. Since she had a very quiet childhood, she developed an unhealthy need for praise and admiration. In 1913, when she was 11 years old, she experienced her first genuine joy on stage. The event took place at the Valencia Theater in San Francisco. During a talent show, she sang a rendition of Pretty Baby and took home the trophy. Their gift to her was $3, or around $98 in today's money. She wasn't transformed by wealth, though. The applause of the spectators could be heard. Something strong washed over her at the sound of it. In an instant, she realized this was her escape route. It was disapproved of by her mother. For Katie, the entertainment industry was a seedy, perhaps malevolent place. Irene disregarded her warning that, if you ever meet the devil, it'll be backstage. It was all about that $3 win. She couldn't let go of the fantasy it offered her. At the age of 14, Irene did something daring. In order to join a theater company in California, she lied about her age. Anyone under the age of 16 was prohibited from working in theaters by law. Thus, she successfully pretended to be older. She got the job. That role was her entry point into the entertainment industry. The risks were obvious to her. She evaded capture despite knowing that doing so would result in her expulsion. She demonstrated her competence and merited her position. The lengths she would go to in order to avoid the starvation and misery she was all too familiar with were demonstrated by that little untruth. In 1917, she dropped out of high school after only 2 years at the age of 15. Her family was in need of assistance after her father's death in 1913. She embarked on an adventure as a member of the Ed Redmond Traveling Theater Troupe. Someone managed to persuade her mother, who was first opposed, to give in. A visitor at Sacramento's Joyon Park remarked, "This kid's got talent." That was enough. Irene returned to El Paso with the company for another performance in August 1918. She had risen to stardom. At the age of 16, an hour and 90 minutes of cyclonic fun with crazy costumes, lighting, and special effects were promised during the performance. Everything in her life had changed. No longer was she a student. She had acting roles under her belt. The relentless effort and unforgiving crowds of vaudeville kept her there. She portrayed naughty but endearing characters in San Francisco. "My age is finally here, and I'm ready for a little tenderness and sweetness, Babette," she sang. Despite the high stakes, her singing brought joy and laughter to the crowd. Performers who were unsuccessful were removed from the stage using hooks at the same Valencia theater, where she had previously won $3. Acts that the audience did not approve of were pelted with eggs and tomatoes. You had to swim or perish. This meant that Irene picked up the ropes quickly. She honed her timing skills. She became nimble and astute. She was hailed as a stylish little star when she was just 15 years old, a chic soubrette. She continued to work and study music in Spanish when she was not on stage. Back then, the theater scene was all gruff guys and rowdy audiences. No easy task for Irene. She had previously claimed that if she sung loud enough, she would avoid being hit by garbage. Her rule was that, make sure they're occupied and you'll be fine. She was short in stature, only 5 feet 2 inches. Yet she was confident. Something peculiar about fame was also something she learned. She claimed that when actors spoke too much, they lost their aura of mystery. She was prepared to strike out on her own by 1921. She developed a partnership with a man called Johnny Ryder. At the Texas Grand, they appeared in a show titled The Biggest Liar in the World. The money was terrible even if she was only starting out. Irene performed 8 shows per week for pitiful wages from 1917 until 1921. It would be handled without hesitation if she fell ill or skipped a performance. Thus, she was always on time. She never missed a class, no matter how bad she felt. Sharing housing and food was commonplace in her life and the troops. Lights, costumes, and effects were all part of the massive performances, but the crew behind them barely had enough to stay alive. Nothing about that slipped Irene's mind. Being poor was a constant worry of hers. For that reason, she was extremely frugal even after she had amassed a considerable fortune. In those formative years, she was on the go all the time. St. Joseph, Missouri was her last home from 1917 to 1922. After a series of stops in San Francisco, Sacramento, Phoenix, El Paso, San Jose, and San Jose, she changed her style for every presentation and job she had. She was dispatched worldwide by the Ed Redmond Company. She slept in inexpensive hotels and lived out of a bag. Near San Jose, she once went to a restaurant with an opulent indoor pool and gushed about how uncommon it was. Usually nothing flashy was present. She was classified as a stage actor in the 1920 census. Having returned to San Francisco with her mother, nothing was certain in her life. She lacked a permanent residence, reliable friends, and reliable financial support. On the other hand, she continued to give performances. The continual motion prepared her for what lay next. Tim Ryan was a comedian who was 25 years old when she wed him in March 1922. She was 20 years old. Tim Ryan and Irene Noble are the names that Tim and Irene took after becoming a married couple. Similar to George Burns and Gracie Allen, they constructed their comedic act around absurd mistakes. They were right on time. A vaudeville performer could make as much as $100 a week, equivalent to around $10,600 in today's money. They were playing major theaters across the United States as headline acts in just 2 years. A true star had emerged from the same little girl who had won $3 for singing Pretty Baby. Their behavior, nevertheless, was peculiar. Irene portrayed the role of the naive and bewildered wife, while Tim took center stage as the sharp one who couldn't hold his tongue. Contrarily, it was the polar opposite offstage. Their finances, reservations, and contracts were all taken care of by Irene. She was totally brilliant. For the most part, Tim didn't stress out. He delegated all authority to her. The twist was a source of stress. Irene despised having to act ignorant while actually doing all the heavy lifting. As long as Irene was in charge, Tim felt obliged to be intelligently. They worked together at Educational Pictures in New York from 1935 to 1937, making 11 short comedies. Quick, low-cost results were the studio's claim to fame. They worked as much as 16 hours a day to film each short in only 3 or 4 days. Minimal sets were used. Personal stunts were required of the actors. On multiple occasions, Irene was injured without disclosing it. A fear of job loss gripped her. Also, the pay was low. Just $150, $200, or about $3,000, $4,000 in today's dollars, was their profit each short. Nonetheless, many took notice of their chemistry and timing. When NBC requested them to fill in for Jack Benny on his radio show while he was on vacation in the summer of 1936, they finally broke through. Fans of Benny's show were in their thousands. Roughly 28.6% of homes listened weekly. Both the exposure and the stress that came with it were enormous. A 30-minute script was memorization homework every week. At NBC, the arguments that occurred during rehearsals became famous. Their vocal tension is audible on the recordings. They began to see their marriage deteriorate due to that pressure. They split up in 1942 after being married for 20 years. Nobody ever said why they didn't have any kids. Some saw it as a professional opportunity. For some, the option may not have been there at all. It crushed Irene's heart. As if she were unable to let go, she continued to use the name Ryan. It was difficult to separate their old vaudeville shows. The sum was quite small. They had previously signed off on their film contracts. Irene didn't wallow in self-pity following her 1942 divorce from Tim Ryan. She leapt into radio and discovered a new emotional and literal voice. Her CBS debut was in 1946 on The Jack Carson Show. Her gruff voice was a hit with listeners as she played a small-town librarian and candy store owner. Years of heavy smoking, which began during her lengthy vaudeville career, had molded that voice. Even though it would have a devastating effect on her health in the long run, it gave her a unique tone that no one else had, and helped her on the radio. Her weekly income of $500 was substantial for someone just out of a marriage, and attempting to make ends meet on their own during that period. However, things were very different in the movies. During the years 1935-1952, Irene was in 36 films. It was mostly in supporting parts. She went unrecognized on numerous occasions. Few people paid attention to her 1947 film role as Mrs. Wernicke in The Woman on the Beach, directed by John Renoir. In 1952, she portrayed Nancy in Bonzo Goes to College. In 1946, she played the role of Louise in Diary of a Chambermaid. She didn't become wealthy from these movies. The majority of work only paid around $300 or $200. Furthermore, her name was frequently omitted from the credits, despite her substantial screen time. Nothing was acknowledged in the long run, and no royalties were paid. She was portrayed by casting directors as the anxious next-door neighbor or the picky friend. They didn't think she could do anything more. People thought she wasn't dramatic enough because of her vaudeville background. There was little solace in her private life either. Harold E. Knox was a film producer who had no acting career when she wed him in March 1946. Their courtship had been brief, just 2 months before the nuptials. Emotions ran high and quickly, perhaps going too quickly. Their 15-year marriage came to an end in 1961. However, they lacked any kind of creative spark, partnership, or offspring. Her workplace was something he despised. The late hours and the company she kept made him unhappy, and she began to feel increasingly isolated as a result. Hollywood started excluding women her age in the early 1950s. The offers stopped coming in her late 40s. Even though males her age were still playing romantic leads, people told her she was too old for starring roles when she was 49. It was painful. For her 2 weeks of employment in Bonzo Goes to College, she only made $750. Despite the fact that her talent warranted more, she began to accept progressively fewer parts. Her age was criticized by many. The reality, though, was that she was much too talented to be given such meager opportunities. Despite the more flexibility she enjoyed on the radio, she was yet confined. She was cast as the comedic elderly woman by producers from the beginning. The audience didn't care that she had more emotional range than they let her display when she replied, "A gal can't cry all the time." This was in response to their persistent requests for her to do emotional breakdowns. The $200 to $400 an episode she made from radio work was enough to keep her afloat, but it never felt like her talents were being recognized. The year 1962 was a watershed moment. She was still game to play Granny Moses on the Beverly Hillbillies even though she was 60 years old. The casting director, however, thought she was too youthful. That didn't sit well with Irene. She contacted Paul Henning, the guy behind the play, and asked, "Do I have to go home and get my gray wig and shawl to convince you?" She proceeded to tell him about her history in Arkansas, making light of a theater management who forbade early admission because patrons would steal seats. Babe and the other audition goers turned to Henning and whispered, "There's Granny." Irene wasn't there merely for the audition. Granny was her new title. My voice, my gait, everything. Buddy Epson, who played Irene Ryan's son-in-law, was just 5.5 years younger than Ryan when the show first aired. They were in their mid-50s. However, she portrayed a character who appeared to be in her 80s. Everything from wigs to wrinkles to shadows. The makeup artists had to utilize it all to give her that 20-something look. In 1963 and 1964, she was nominated for an Emmy alongside Mary Tyler Moore and Shirley Booth, thanks to her makeover. However, she continued to smoke behind the scenes. She would light a cigarette from another cigarette while filming. No matches or lighters were ever used by her. There was no stopping her. Her gruff, beloved voice was a result of her smoking. However, her health issues also persisted. Her co-stars, notably Max Baer Jr., were perpetually concerned for her well-being. Although she never decelerated, the money she had was always well spent. Despite her extraordinary six-figure income in the 1960s, $500,000, She chose to reside in a modest 1,800-square-foot house in Santa Monica at 107 Esparta Way. This mansion dates back to 1915. It included an antique stove, a small garden brimming with bougainvillea and mint green cabinets. No, she didn't buy homes or have lavish parties. Property and stocks were her investments. Approximately $6 million was in her savings account by 1973, when she had saved more than $1 million. Only her cats and a handful of trusted friends shared her home. It was that. Just like her lines, she was quite particular. On the Beverly Hillbillies, she had a reputation for getting into heated arguments with producers over scripted speech. During her vaudeville tours, she had the opportunity to interact with genuine Appalachians. Thus, she was able to distinguish between authentic speech and misconceptions. In fact, she was instrumental in developing Granny's biography, suggesting that the character be a dunked Baptist rather than sprinkled, revered Jefferson Davis and despise Yankees and revenuers. She was more than an actor. She was safeguarding a heritage. It was widely believed that Irene Ryan would retire quietly once the Beverly Hillbillies concluded in 1971. However, she stunned everyone by securing a significant role on Broadway at the age of 70. Pippin, which premiered on October 23, 1972, featured her as the feisty Grandma Bera. She only spent approximately 10 minutes on stage, but her performance of No Time at All was enough to captivate the audience. Standing ovations were practically constant responses from the emotionally impacted audiences she performed for. Some audience members couldn't help but clap right in the middle of the performance. Her enthusiasm, wit, and timing were fantastic. One of Broadway's longest runs, the show went on to run for 144 performances. And among the most talked about parts of the production was Irene's, the 27th Tony Awards, which took place on March 25, 1973, included a nomination for Best Featured Actress in a Musical for Irene. Competing against younger artists from more recent shows, she was 70 years old. Critics, however, thought she deserved it for her stunning performance in Pippin. The nomination was an honor in and of itself, even though she lost the race. After a long career in radio, television, and vaudeville, it finally came together. It proved she wasn't merely a comic relief on television. Her talent was genuine, and she possessed the poise and power to captivate an audience in person. Bob Fosse, renowned for his kinetic and powerful style, created the choreography she was required to do. Irene worked so hard on it that many onstage employees were unaware that she was becoming ill. A sorrowful note was added to what ought to have been a time of victory by the nomination, which occurred only weeks before her passing. March 10, 1973 was a watershed moment. Something terrible happened that day at the Saturday matinee. During her performance, Irene passed out on stage. Hundreds of spectators watched as she abruptly lost composure and was removed from the stage. Neither a stumble nor an error occurred. Suddenly, she had a stroke in full public view. She was rushed to a New York hospital without delay. However, her physicians quickly decided to return her to California by plane. The end began at that same moment, as seen by a whole Broadway audience in real time. When she returned to California, the doctors at Santa Monica's St. John's Hospital broke the terrible news to her. It wasn't simply a stroke that Irene was bouncing back from. The most severe form of brain tumor, a glioblasto, had been discovered, and it was inoperable. By that point, it was game over. In addition, she suffered from atherosclerotic heart disease. Her hidden exhaustion and bewilderment were explained by the rapid growth of the tumor. It didn't stop her from trying to get back on stage, though. Despite her doctor's insistence that she not perform, her enthusiasm for performing triumphed over her fears and pains. The fact that she was never informed the facts while being told to rest is even more tragic. Not informing her of her terminal condition was a choice that doctors and her family made, which was typical at the time. She fooled herself into thinking she was improving in her last weeks while she actually began to deteriorate. Later on, Irene's co-stars came clean about her disguising her symptoms. According to Max Baer Jr., who played Jethro, she was a chronic smoker on set and had been exhibiting symptoms of major health issues prior to her time with Pippin. She amazed the rigorous director Bob Fosse by continuing to do challenging dances at an advanced age. She put up a brave front, but she was actually struggling. Severe headaches plagued her, cognitive disorientation, and bodily fatigue. Still, she continued to perform night after night as if nothing had happened. The true gravity of the situation was unknown to anyone on the production crew. She was opposed to being replaced. What she had begun, she wished to complete. Irene spent her final days alone at her peaceful Santa Monica home after being sent home. She was childless. Her sister was no longer with her. Following her second divorce in 1961, she chose not to remarry. Nobody was available to give her constant attention. According to her friends who paid her visits, she spent a lot of time alone thinking about the past and composing letters. $1 million was in her estate and her career was thriving. Still, she frequently broached the subject of how isolated she felt. This is what she meant when she remarked, "To really love show business, you have to be of it, not just in it." She lived by that statement. Unfortunately, she came to regret not being able to have a family since she prioritized her work. The home she occupied in her final days transformed into a sanctuary of quiet contemplation. The same woman who had brought happiness to millions was now quietly disappearing from view, abandoned by the masses. Just 47 days following her stroke on stage on April 26, 1973, she passed away. Her age was 75. Few news outlets covered her demise. The once laugh riot of an actress died away peacefully. On May 1st, her funeral was placed. A small group of friends and co-stars, including Max Baer, Buddy Eason, Bob Hope, Bob Fosse, and Ben Vine, were present, rather than a large parade or throng. She shared a crypt with her sister at Santa Monica's Woodland Memorial Cemetery. Only the word Granny appeared on her tombstone. Her last name was the one that had made her famous. What happened to her home at 107 Esparta Way stunned fans after her death. Built in 1915, it was small yet endearing. Despite her considerable wealth, which reached $500,000 per year, while she was a member of the Beverly Hillbillies, she never bought a mansion. There was no one to take over the property after her death, so it promptly went into disrepair. The ceiling gave way. All of the windows broke. Over what was once a lovely garden, weeds sprung up. Indoors, her photographs and furnishings were abandoned to collect dust. No one seemed concerned about protecting the area where she had spent her dying days, and time seemed to have stood still. Both on stage and off, her existence faded into thin air. However, she did leave a legacy, even in death. She established the Irene Ryan Foundation in 1972, the year before she died away. She chose to support young actors instead of passing her wealth on to her children or relatives. She bequeathed acting scholarships the full $1 million from her estate. As part of her charitable work, the American College Theater Festival at the Kennedy Center was a partner. The national champion receives $5,000 annually, while 16 regional winners each receive $500. Thousands of students have benefited from her work even after all these years have passed. She transformed her solitude into an enduring testament, granting others the opportunity to experience the aspiration she had battled tirelessly for. Still, her narrative was underrepresented in the media. Short obituaries referred to her as Granny from the Beverly Hillbillies upon her passing. In-depth profiles and retrospectives were conspicuously absent. It was as if everyone had forgotten her full potential, her ability to conquer Broadway at 70 years old, her ability to stand her ground against Bob Fosse, her ability to make audiences laugh till they cried, and her dignity in the face of death. Even though her narrative was worthy of being shouted from the rooftops, it was subtly wiped away. The jokes and smiles betrayed a woman's deep desire for a family. Before her marriage to Harold Knox, she was married twice to Tim Ryan. Unfortunately, these marriages did not last. No offspring ever came from her. She reportedly confided in friends about that discomfort frequently. She felt a void in her heart that fame couldn't fill. On occasion, she questioned whether her efforts would be truly meaningful, if her legacy was not to be continued. She did, however, manage to establish a family of her own, not by descent but by skill. A certain mother pride washed over her as she quietly observed the youthful Pippin cast members backstage. Additionally, she ensured that future generations of artists would have access to something she herself did not have through her foundation. If you want more videos, don't forget to hit like and subscribe and press the bell icon. Thanks for watching.